welcome to the Once and Future podcast, where we examine how the seeds of the past bear fruit in the present. I am Heather, one of your co-hosts, and
Liene, your other co-host.
hello and welcome. I am so excited about today's podcast because we are going to talk vampires, where they come from, and how they have become the sexy, sparkly creatures that they are today. So is there anything that you would like to add in the beginning before I get started on all of the fun facts I've learned in the past week?
Today's podcast is going to be on how the gruesome, gory seeds bore sparkly fruit in the present.
And how and how the very monstrous becomes a sexy, pale white male in the future, and seeing about why and how, perhaps. Or at least our theories about why and how.
And I mean, I think as always, with like any topic we choose on this podcast, we're interested in things not only that like have singly stood the test of time, but also perhaps, as in the case of vampires, have stood the test of time in a more broad sense. So like last time we talked a lot about, the topic wasn't Peter Pan, but we talked a lot about Peter Pan and how like a specific character or a specific story has stood the test of time. Here, like where it's a concept that has stood the test of time, and there's been so many different versions of a concept, not necessarily a specific character, although certainly there are some Hall of Famers that keep coming up again.
and how tropes have attached themselves to this. So, and I think the same thing happened in fairy tales, where you have like a basic fairy tale structure and then certain tropes get attached to that, and then they become patterns that we recognize in modern literature. And so that's what I was really looking for when I was doing all of my research for this one, was seeing the kinds of patterns that were specific to our Western understandings of vampire, and then how that disseminates.
Well, and also, I know like we briefly talked about who we are and our backgrounds in our intro episode, but I mean, your degree, and degrees plural, are kind of more in like literature and in the written word and in plays and performance and things like that. My degree is in anthropology. And so I did a little bit study vampirism and vampires in my anthropology degree, but again, not as like a story and not as like themes and tropes, but as like, where did this come from and why did people think this was a thing? And so that's kind of what I know more about and what I've always been slightly more interested in than an actual story about vampires, because I don't particularly like vampire stories, but I
just how you don't particularly like fairy tales.
Yeah, also true. Well, actually, fairy tales are like better than. I really don't like myths. But I love studying like culture's beliefs in myths. So the same thing with vampires. Like, where did that come from? Why did people believe this? Why did so many different cultures believe this? And then how that becomes a story. And then the story has a life of its own outside of what originally caused it to come about.
And now I get to plug my dissertation, which nobody besides my little group of advisors have read. But it was actually on death and desire in the early modern period. So the ways that sexuality and death got performed on the stage. And I feel like as I was researching for vampires, it was like this perfect precursor to vampirism, because modern vampirism kind of combines those things, are the kinds of things that seduce us and the kinds of things that scare us, this perfect combination of death and desire. And so it was like this nice little throwback to my own research interests from way back when. And my dissertation is actually called Love Her After, in the sense of like loving somebody after they are dead, but still loving the physical body. And I think vampirism and our attention to the vampire plays a lot into those tropes. So that's also why I'm excited to talk about it today.
Well, yeah, for me being mainly interested in like the ways that like the not vampire stories, but the people who are telling them interest me. And so then like in the same way that like the origin of it, I think is fascinating. How did the first people ever come up with the freaking vampire as an idea?
Right.
But then in the present day, we're many, many steps removed from like the original origins of like, this is where it came from. But the way it's still fascinating to watch the way that people can, either in the way that they're consuming or in the way that they're telling vampire stories, they are telling on themselves and they are telling on the zeitgeist. And like
Mhm.
whatever is the current like political issue, the current social issue, the current just topical trend, the current interest in terms of like what is like lustful romantic and you know things like that, like
Mhm.
vampire stories like are this amazing kind of like I don't know litmus test for like what's currently going on, and so that is fascinating to me.
That is a perfect segue into talking about the beginnings
We
of
planned it that way.
we planned it that way because that is exactly what I was thinking about as I was looking at the very first authored vampire stories. And just like last week, we talked about the difference between like the long oral tradition of fairy tales versus when they were written down. The same thing happens with vampires. It probably happens with a lot of mythic tropes and like monsters and things like that. But just like fairy tales, vampires have this like really long oral tradition, and they're very much like these monsters from lore. And just like fairy tales, it's one of those things where it blends the reality with the unreality. And vampires, in particular, from what I saw in like Western Europe and even like Eastern Europe to some degree as well, and Southern like Western traditions, it was very much this like monster and this way of processing death because like early vampires and those oral traditions and those storytelling traditions seem to be more like how we think of zombies today, just like the risen dead. They look more like corpses. They weren't really
Well,
ever
that's because
human-like.
they come from the fact that people buried people that were possibly still alive,
Mhm.
and there's the fact that when you people didn't, like, know how decomposition worked
Right,
necessarily, and
right.
also that decomposition has, like, a great degree like, there's a lot of variability, and so then when they, for whatever reason, would dig up a corpse, the corpse would look sometimes not even a
Desiccated, right?
well, but also sometimes more alive than it looked when it was alive because of the way
Mhm,
that the body bloats sometimes, and so
mm,
that makes it look like you're, like, not just, like, alive, but healthier than you were when we buried you, and, like, there can be still, like, blood in the system that comes out, and so if you, like, stake a corpse, there can be gases in there that create, like, noises, so it sounds like a body that's, like, groaning, or even if you haven't staked it, even if it's still buried, like, those gases escaping can create noises that sound like groaning. The way the skin falls back and reveals nails and hair, it makes it look like they're growing.
mhm,
Um, if you did bury somebody alive and they started scratching at the top of the coffin and then obviously like suffocated, but if you like dug them up, you would find scratch marks on the top of their coffin. All these things together, like, were making people think that the dead can
the dead
rise.
rise. Yeah, I mean, it's very much an explanation for something that we know scientifically now, and I think that's where a lot of myths come from in general, just like us trying to understand our surroundings and just not having the scientific knowledge. So I do think it's not by accident that we get our first vampire authored story after we have the beginnings of the scientific revolution,
Well, I was about
and
to
in the
say that, like, it's interesting the fact that, like, we used to need it to explain a really, kind of straightforward kind of, like, science biology thing, and
Mhm,
now it's not that, "Oh, we don't need vampires anymore because we've moved past needing to understand this because we do understand this." Vampires still have may remained relevant, not because they serve that specific purpose, but they still serve a function in terms of people trying to make sense of or trying to address a certain thing that is usually now more symbolic, metaphorical, societal, as opposed to like a literal body and what's happening with it. But like vampires like were this like crutch we leaned on to explain a biological phenomenon, and they remain like a cultural crutch.
mhm, and I think it's like it's one of those things where there's like a simple answer and a longer answer, right? Like the simple answer is we all die and we all struggle with that, and I think that
Well, I intend to live forever. So far, so good.
Whatever. And I think we all have that moment, especially in, when we're young, uh, just about like what it would mean to live forever and dealing with our own mortality. And so I think the vampire is one of those like stories and creatures and tropes that helps us work through all of our feelings about that, especially our fears about it. And just like any kind of horror movement, it's like something that is tantalizing, but also something that's scary. And all of our complicated emotions get shoved on to this character. I'm going to start with my first fun fact. Okay, so we all know the story of
I
Frankenstein,
think it's up to us
but
to
it's
judge if this
probably
fact is fun. So you can share a fact, and then I'll tell you if it
Okay.
was fun.
Well, how about this? I'm gonna get you involved, and I want you to tell me the story of how you remember Mary Shelley creating Frankenstein.
I wasn't there for when she did it, so I know I'm not as young as I used to be, but I don't think I look old enough to have been
You're
there
actually a
for when.
vampire and you were there at the same time.
Well, I mean, that would be telling. But do you mean, like, how I remember, like, the story of it or how I remember learning the story of it?
Yeah, yeah. Like, what did you learn about Mary Shelley creating Frankenstein? Like, who was she with? What was she doing? How did the story come about?
They were telling scary stories, they being herself, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron, and they challenged each other to tell the scariest story, and she won with Frankenstein.
Yes, and this person that you left out of that group was Lord Byron's doctor, who ended up going to write The Vampire, which was first published in 1819. And I just think this is such a fun fact because all we remember is that Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley were there. But it was actually Lord Byron's doctor who wrote the first vampire story that we have and at
The
least in like
reason
Western
that
folk.
we don't care about it is that for once, the woman overshadowed the men in history, and all we care about is that Mary Shelley was there and wrote Frankenstein.
And I love that, like, they were also like, so it was like really rainy and it was like partially due to this like weird weather phenomenon that was happening in Europe at the time that was causing this really wet summer. So they were all like bored and like tired of the rain and it was dark and they were also high on laudanum.
So
So they were kind of like
you're saying it was a dark and stormy night.
I I am, in fact, saying it was several dark and stormy nights. So I just think it's fun that, like, they were also there when the creation of, like, the first vampire and this is the first time that we see in Western literature where the vampire becomes something more than it's this monstrous creature out for blood, but it becomes a sophisticated man who can seduce both men and women into following them and, I mean, the story wasn't I mean, it's fine, but, to our standards, it's a very, like, basic story where this young man, becomes intrigued with this older man who, like, invites him on this trip around Europe, through things that happen, he finds out he's a vampire because he's like luring women in, young women in, and then they like mysteriously die. And then the vampire gets a hold of his sister, and everybody dies at the end except the vampire who goes on and I'm assuming continues to murder young women. But it really is the first story that creates this craze of about vampires, and it really was super popular at the time. It started like stage plays and I mean it just becomes this popular trope at the time. I think it helps because the gothic tradition was starting and gothic stories were so hot back then.
Well, there's a fun intersection between vampirism and consumption where they both look the same. And they're both so sexy, so what's not to like?
The sexiest disease is tuberculosis.
Well, the sexiest disease is vampirism, closely
Right.
followed by consumption.
Yeah. Both having to do with blood.
And
So
paleness.
and paleness.
It's
And
the
so
Tim Burton favorites.
And so he really I mean, he doesn't write anything else, but it becomes this, like, famous thing, and people actually thought that Lord Byron wrote it at first because they didn't think that his, like, young doctor, whose name I can't even remember now, but they pretended that Byron actually published it first because they knew that that would get people to buy it because Byron was, very popular at the time, and then later it came out that this other guy
So
wrote
you're
it.
saying it was like the ye olde version of James Patterson Presents.
Yes, exactly. And it was actually based on because like vampires, like as we know them, started to show up in poetry before this time. But it wasn't as overt as it was in the story. They were always called something else besides vampires. And it was more metaphorical, but I mean it was showing up in poems. And Byron had this like half finished poem about a vampire, but it was kind of racist because the vampire was a Turkish man and it was like, against Moorish looking people. And it was actually a slur against like these kinds of people. But this was actually one of like the first that made the vampire like a white normal guy besides the fact that he's a vampire. So it really does shift. And it's doing a lot of what a lot of vampire stories in the Gothic era and in just the 20th century more generally, which is talking about sexuality and how it ties into death, especially like female sexuality and virginhood, and ideas about chastity and sexuality, which was like, something the Victorian era and the Gothic era was like really stressed about was, a woman's virginity. So
Well, which is
that was
this
like
is
the crux of that
all
one.
this is all quite a ways away from, like, peasants looking at a corpse that looks kinda like it could be alive again and needs to be staked before it eats the children, where it's just like it's something that goes bump in the night. Like, it's something to be
Mhm.
scared of, something to be fought, something to be killed. It's like you slay dragons, you slay vampires. This idea of, like, I think nowadays we more so think of vampires as, like, a character in a story, that it's like a human that has vampirism is kind of, like, more so how it comes up,
Mhm.
and we think of it as, like, oh, what it would be like to have these qualities and to live with the fact that you have to live on blood or to be, around somebody like that if you are a friend of theirs or in love with them or something like that. But these
Mhm.
were very much not the concerns of the people that like first created a kind of mythos that becomes the vampire. They were just
Mhm.
like, this is scary. I think we should kill it because it's causing, a problem. It's not, it's a monster. It's not like a character or something that has pathos.
Yeah. And I do think that what makes the vampire scary in this story and why it becomes so intriguing is because the vampire looks like everybody else. And at the end of the story, you kind of wonder like how come nobody saw that this guy was weird because he's very mysterious. He only comes out at night. I mean, there are definitely tells and there's like a bit of ridiculousness to it. But there is this kind of fear that like the vampire could be anyone. And we don't know who the monster is. And sometimes by the time you find out who the monster is, it's already too late. It's interesting because like the first book to be published after this one was called The Black Vampire. And it was published just a few months after like this one was. And it was the first American vampire story. The other one was European. And this was actually like a parody about like making fun of vampires. And I thought it was hilarious that like the first American vampire story is a parody making fun of vampires. So um, but I got excited when I first saw the title because I thought that it meant that it was written by a Black author, but that was getting my hopes up way too much. And it was actually, we actually don't know who it was specifically, but they have some ideas. It was under the pseudonym Uriah Darcy, but they think that he was like some other author at the time, even though we don't really know. But it's supposed to be a comedy and a parody, kind of pointing out like how ridiculous it is that anybody would fall in love with like the silly vampire character. And like how like a sane woman wouldn't fall in love, like wouldn't fall for these things that the vampire is doing.
I want to say that's complimentary
Yeah.
of women.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's like one of those parodies where like it's not, it's hard to pin down what it was actually doing. The story is unlike other vampire stories at the time because the main character, the Black vampire, is Black. He's from like he's from Haitian descent, and it's about the slave trade and about this particular slave who is trying to be murdered by his master, and the master does not succeed, and this Black man turns into a vampire, and then it's sort of a revenge narrative against white slave masters. He ends up marrying a white woman, and then the plot is like really convoluted, but like eventually he like meets up with other Haitians, and they're being led, like the Haitian slaves are being led by these like master vampires who are trying to get them to revolt. And it's supposed to be this commentary, like you talked about before, how vampires are, how these stories are dealing with like current cultural moments.
Well, I was
This
about to
one is
say that just from the few examples we've gone through, like it's, peasants don't understand anything about the world around them and are like, we thought grandma was dead, but grandma might be alive and drinking blood and we're worried about it, stake her. And then, like that's the thing, that's where we're at as a
Mhm.
society. And then later we have these more ideas about sort of like again women's virtue and chastity and sexuality and these kinds of things start getting kind of like grafted onto the story of a
Mhm.
vampire. Then we have the example you're just giving now, where it's not so much about the individual and like the chaste versus the sexual, like really specific to the individual. It's more this like broader cultural like phenomenon, and it's both parodying and also like conversing on a particular current cultural issue and using vampirism to do it.
Yeah, and this one specifically is, like, critiquing the Haitian Revolution, that had happened just, like, 10 or 15 years prior, the only successful slave rebellion to ever happen, and so this was critiquing it, but a lot of scholars, they can't really tell. I mean, it's obviously, like, not great, in its racial politics, but because it's a parody, some of it reads as like being in support of the slave revolt, and it's kind of like one of those like one of those images where if you look at it one way, it reads this way, and if you look at it the other way, it's one
Or
way.
it's also the way that a lot of modern day people have like Schrodinger's joke where like they said a thing and if you're offended by it, oh, well, it was a joke. But if you're not offended by it, they're like, hell yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. And so you see that kind of in the criticism of this, that no one can really decide if it's like this intelligent critique on slave revolts or if it's like absolutely horrendously
Which
racist.
I think also brings up an interesting kind of dichotomy in like how vampirism is used, where vampires are it's weird that they can be a surrogate, a substitution for, an allegory for both oppressor and oppressed. So some
Mhm.
stories take the form of like vampires are these like ancient overlords who are rich and wealthy and they are like, drinking the blood of peasants. So like Dracula.
Mhm.
And versus other stories where they say vampires are othered by society because they're misunderstood. And so they can be, it is the other. It is the it can be racism, it can be gender and sexuality, it can be the poor people, like class warfare. It can stand in for a lot of those things. And vampires, depending on the story you're telling, can take either side of that. And I think that that's really, really fascinating. That the same, because they'll usually have really similar lore in terms of what a vampire is. It's like a
Mhm.
person that drinks blood in order to survive, may or may not be able to go out in sunlight. And like that's what a vampire is. And like the fact that it can be a stand-in for oppression or it can be a stand-in for the oppressed is kind of like, I don't know, speaks to the crazy versatility and might be part of the reason that vampires have like quote unquote stood the test of time, is because of like depending on sort of like which pieces of lore you're choosing to include, which then also I think depending on what you're trying to do with your vampire story,
Mhm.
which social issue you're talking about, which cultural phenomenon you're addressing, that's how, when you look at the menu of things that a vampire can do and has historically been able to do or not do or is part of their lore, when you look at that menu, like which of these pieces of lore serve the kind of like message that I want to talk about? Because if your message is about like being othered, you're going to choose different things off of the menu than if you're choosing a message about them being the oppressor and their metaphor for like the rich eating the poor.
Yeah, and I think for this one, it's really interesting because the black vampire is at once the bad guy, but he's also a very sympathetic figure in the text as well. And so I think it
A
kind of
bit like
represents
Frankenstein.
yeah. The Black Vampire was also one of the first like authored texts I could tell that actually includes making other vampires by making them drink blood. Usually in like some of the more monstrous myths, it's just that like they have to bite you and then you turn into one. And now a lot of times it's like they bite you and then you have to suck their blood. But in the Black Vampire, the white woman that he marries, he turns her into a vampire by like cutting open the heart of her son and like drinking the blood, which is like one of the first times that I've actually seen that I could see of making another vampire. Which I think is interesting too, just thinking about like the different ways that they kind of create that lore of like making another one.
Well, and I think that's so like this on the menu of things a vampire might be able to do. I think if the story you're telling is one of like an oppressed class that's being, vilified or it's being hunted, I think not always, of course, but oftentimes those stories will choose to have the vampire not be able to create more vampires where they just
Mhm.
it's simply a different creature. And one of the things that is like true about this creature is that they suck blood in order to survive and that they may or may not be immortal. But this idea of being able to like live off of and also like spread your kind in this really kind of pernicious way, in
Mhm.
this really violent way, and kind of like taking away people's bodily autonomy and taking away people's consent and being able to turn them into you without them consenting to it. That is the narrative of an oppressor. That's not a narrative of the oppressed. And so I think when you're, again, picking and choosing what is going into your vampire lore, that's a part of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about then, like, what it says about, like, the most famous, of what we think of the first vampire story, Dracula, even though he's already picking and choosing from this tradition that was happening, because there was lots of vampire stories up until Bram Stoker. He writes at the end of the 20th century when all these people, were writing towards the beginning and throughout. And I ended up listening to Carmilla last week, which is one of our first female vampires that we get. She is a female vampire and she actually seeks out other women. And you see a lot of that. It was also one of the first ones that really plays into the vampire being seductive. A lot of that story reads as every time the vampire is interacting with the woman whose point of view we get, it's very sensual and it's very much like trying to deal with falling in love and being seduced and all of the scary feelings that comes from being seduced and all of those questions about consent and discomfort and like wondering if it's okay. And it ends up, there's a lot of like obviously queer readings to the text because the vampire bite in that story is obviously a metaphor for orgasm, which again is the first time you see that. And that was published in, I think the 1870s, like right before Bram Stoker was doing it. And so this story actually sets off that kind of frightening sexuality of the vampire. Before, the vampires were just like choosing women, but you don't really get their perspectives. But in both Carmilla and Dracula, you get the female perspective of them being seduced, and that kind of fear that comes along with that, and as an exploration of like women's desire and agency.
Well, here, okay, so like before I was saying, like more on a societal level, right? The oppressor versus the oppressed. Vampires can be both depending on what you're doing. But in this more intimate sense, some stories will have like the vampire represent the sort of the individualized oppressor, the oppressor within like a personal relationship. And this is if like basically the vampire attraction or the vampire bite or the vampire pheromones or the vampire venom or all these kinds of things, they act to like overcome a woman's inhibitions and take away her autonomy and consent. It's kind of like a magical roofie. It's like, it's a magical it's a way to like drug somebody and make them behave in a way that they wouldn't normally behave. And talking about resisting that, or are you a victim if you're like enjoying it and consenting to it in the moment, and these kinds of conversations where the vampire is still in control and they're the ones that are like using you for something that they want and how you're responding to it. But vampires, again, equally are portrayed as victims of their own lusts when it's their ability or inability to control this need for blood. And so the stories like equally position vampires as the victims, and it can be now a metaphor for alcoholism and drug addiction and things like that, where now, again, the same type of character, same things going on, they're seeking out people to drink their blood, but it's the vampire that is like the victim of the story and serves like that narrative purpose rather than being the one that people are being victim to so much.
Yeah. And one of the interesting theories about Bram Stoker was that he was possibly queer. And so a lot of the story about being seduced by the vampire and struggling with that is actually like him dealing with his own sexuality, because Dracula opens by a man getting seduced. And there is this very much this tension between like a man biting another man. That again, like you see for the first time in these later texts. When it happens in the earlier texts, it's very much just like, oh, this happened and then it was bad and we move on. But in both Dracula and Carmilla, we get this sense that there is a sexual exchange happening and there's a lot of anxiety. And some people believe that he was trying to like deal with his own sexuality, and how like vampirism becomes this like place to put specifically sexual anxieties on in these stories.
But again, in the more like societal oppressor role that vampires can serve, I think that also, not to take away from the dealing with homosexual feelings, like
that's just one. That's one reading.
No, but like in that story, but in many others, the way that like we have obviously the very obvious, the rich are eating the poor. They're like literally like sucking them dry. But it's not, it doesn't, it only adds to the allegory, the fact that the rich are so charismatic, that the fact
Mhm.
that you, like, willingly allow them to drink you dry because, like, the rich and powerful can wow you, the rich and powerful can be, again, charismatic, can be very beautiful, it can be very appealing in a way that makes you want to give up things to them. And so vampires are this manifestation of this, like, literalizing the way that the rich can wow you and can woo you and can make you fall, you'll fall, quote unquote, under their spell even without any kind of vampiric magic. And then the vampire is just kind of like this, turned up to 11.
Yeah, in my notes, I have in caps lock and bold, "Capitalism!" exclamation point. Because again, the very first vampire story, the reason why, the main character ends up going with the vampire is because the vampire is this rich duke. Like, he's very charismatic.
Yeah, I
He's
think
super interested in him.
Marx had some, like, comments to make about the rich using specifically, like, vampire language.
I haven't read it, but that makes so much sense, and it really is like the young guy, he is invited on this, like, European tour that he wouldn't have gotten to go on because he was not in the same class, and, I mean, when you look on like, forward into Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, you see the same like, a similar exchange with Lestat and Louis, but it's it's the opposite, like, Lestat is the one that, like, needs like, he has the power of immortality, but he needs the money, and that's what Louis has, and so that's what he give like, that he's giving immortality in exchange for power and money because Louis is the one that has the land and the money, he's a
Which is
plantation owner.
a neat segue into the sometimes depiction of vampirism and, like, vampire with their food as being a symbiotic relationship and not a purely parasitic one. And
Mhm,
so, obviously, Fledgling by Octavia Butler comes to mind in a very, like, actually, like, symbiotic situation. In lesser degrees, oftentimes it'll be like, well, vampire blood sometimes, in stories, not only do the vampires themselves are they can magically heal immediately, but their blood can confer that healing upon other people. So, like,
mhm,
a vampire, like, okay, they might suck your blood, but they can also heal you. A vampire might suck your blood, but they're also, like, able to do things for you because of, like, how fast they are or because of how
mhm,
immortal they are or whatever it is. And so stories will often again play with the fact that, like, well, okay, if we agree that the rich are eating us, do the rich not also give us things in return?
mhm, yeah, and, in a lot of African myths about, vampirism, it's actually the colonists who are vampires, and that actually was almost like a literal interpretation as well because the colonizers would go over and take, like, vials of their blood from them, to do experiments on and things like that, and so the way that they talked about colonizers is being like actual vampires. And you have stories like, I think it's Certain Dark Things by Marina, I forgot what her name is, but
Sylvia
it's
Moreno
again this like,
Garcia.
yes, thank you. I was like, you will know. But that again, that sense of white colonizers or white settlers, like just taking and taking and taking, and desiccating a land. But in that way, it's a parasitic
Well, it's
one.
too, I mean, like, we often see in vampire stories where, like, the rich, like, noble vampire, they are using slaves and servants as, like,
Hmm.
their source of blood. And so
Hmm.
that's obviously, yeah, like, it's not just the rich, but it's also, like, literally people that work for you, people that you, quote, unquote, "own" if they are your slaves,
Hmm.
using them, which then also, again, in terms of, like, metaphors and allegories in the way that we will sometimes have troubling questions about, like, okay, so a vampire owns slaves and is eating those slaves because they're a vampire sucking their blood. But is that actually different from a human keeping chickens?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
and so that's oftentimes, like, what a story will do and be like, make you say, like, well, if a vampire is a different thing from a human, is it like, it bothers me because 'cause I'm the chicken, but, like, is that any more evil? Like, this is their livestock essentially.
And that's really, if we're talking about, so we've talked about the once, right? Like all of these predecessors, and how they've evolved. But then we get to Interview with the Vampire, which is really the first vampire novel that that goes into all of these questions because we get from the vampire's perspective. And Anne Rice is really interested in all of the philosophical questions that comes with being a vampire. And that's exactly what she talks about. Like, if vampires are a different species and on a different plane, and that's what Lestat says all of the time throughout the book, that humans aren't on the same level as vampires. Vampires are godlike to some degree, and humans are just food. So they don't offer us anything besides food, and that's how we should think about them. And then Louis struggles the entire book, Mr. Emo Boy, the entire book
Because
with
Louis wants
what
to be a
that means.
vegetarian.
Yes.
It's like, but they're so cute. I like them. I don't want to eat them.
And it's like really this internal struggle with his own humanity. This idea that like he became a vampire for the power of immortality, but he struggles with the loss of humanity in that, and like and whether or not those things can coexist. And a lot
Well,
later vampire stuff don't seem to do
I was
struggle with
gonna
that
say
as
that, like,
much.
a lot of we haven't really touched on this at all, amazingly, shockingly, frankly. I think that says something about us, not about the topic. But the religious component that is
Oh,
so present
yeah,
in
that.
vampire
Oh, yeah,
stories.
that.
It's like the idea that, like, that's the thing that a vampire can't handle is a crucifix. The fact that a
Right.
vampire can't cross into holy ground, that a vampire is hurt by holy water, the fact that a
Mhm.
vampire's soul is either like non-existent or that it's a human that's damned forever. And so then, like, it's this whole Faustian bargain of like, if it's a story in which you can become a vampire, it's not a different creature, a different species, that it's something that you can turn into in a sort of magical
Mhm.
way. Um, is that what's happening? Are you saying, okay, in exchange for my soul, I get to like live forever and be fast and young and everything? And so then that's the conversation it's having. It's a conversation about like sacrifice and about, the cost benefit analysis of these life decisions.
Yeah, and I think, we start that because yeah, the Western, I mean, you can't divorce like any story in Western literature from like those religious roots because it was so ingrained as
Okay, but
people's.
this one is a little more just like overtly. Like every story has like religious undertones or overtones
Well,
from the
okay, so
West,
what I
but like
would
literal like the crucifix is like the death for them is like a
well,
very
but so that's what's
obvious.
interesting about Anne Rice's story is the way that she deals with that is that God is not real. That like they can go into churches, that like that church and those beliefs are just that. They're just like people's beliefs.
Well, and this also brings me to another thing that I think is fascinating about vampire stories, the more recent they are, is that
Mhm.
vampire stories, vampire books and movies are some of the most meta-textual stories around because
Mhm.
almost any vampire story has to at some point address the
Right, yeah,
lore.
allure.
And
Yeah, for
so, like, I
sure.
can think of, like, no other type of story that so overtly comes out and is like, "Okay, let's address the lore. Do we eat garlic? Yes, no. Do we
Mhm.
stand sunlight? Yes, no. Can we go into churches? Yes, no. Do we have reflections? Yes, no." Like, it has to come out and not just say what the lore is, but also what the lore isn't. It has to every single vampire story is like, "Oh, I know what you think about vampires." It has that conversation somewhere
Mhm.
where someone's like, "Oh, that's what you've heard, but you're wrong. Here's how it really goes with vampires in the real world of this story."
Well, and that's what's even more interesting about these predecessors is that even the very first stories are doing that. Like the Black Vampire is the the first parody in reaction to the first authored one, and it's already doing that. It's already establishing what its lore is against the very first one. And at the end of that one, everybody gets like baptized and they get to they get like cured of their vampirism and they get to go like be Baptists, like live the rest of their life or whatever. But it's already responding to that. And so does Carmilla. Carmilla responds to it with like, okay, well, these are my magical powers. And then, so I think it's interesting that it is also one of those stories that's already being self-referential from like the very beginning. And I can't think of one that does that from the very beginning and throughout every iteration.
'Cause I don't think if I think of stories that have fairies or werewolves or zombies or anything, there's never like a here's what you think you know, but here's the truth of it in this version of things. It's just
Yeah,
vampire. It might just be
I
because
feel
there's
like
so much lore with vampires. There's not
yeah.
that many things to know about a werewolf.
Well, and it's like you need all these plot devices with like new ones too. It's like I think of like the Vampire Diaries where they have like magic rings so they can go in the sun so they can like do more stuff. the Twilight vampires like sparkle so that they can do more stuff plot wise in the
Well, that's
daytime.
also I think it's really fascinating is that vampire stories, okay, in addition to being like, here's what we do, here's what we don't do, in the way that like we started this episode by kind of me talking about how what I find interesting is like how a culture to begin with invented this concept and then the proliferation of that concept throughout like time and literature. But the way that vampire stories again are really this like conscious kind of the reason that you think this about vampires is because the truth about vampires is this, which made people think like there's so many vampire stories that do that, where they're basically giving you like an anthropology lesson within the universe of this vampire story, where they're like, oh, well, see, the thing is that like the reason that people think we don't have a reflection is because like we shine a lot and so then like that bounces off of the mirror and then it's like hard to see us in it or something, or the reason they think we can't go in the
Mhm.
sun is because it's really obvious what we are in the sun, so we don't tend to go into the sun but we actually can, but that's why you think that we don't. Like they'll always, it's like this, oh, here's the truth behind the myth, and like that's how they're addressing it. But it's just so fascinating that like they have to do that, and also the
Mhm.
way in which they go about it is usually again telling about what type of metaphor they're going for, what type of allegory, what type of message they're going for.
Yeah, because even just thinking about zombies, like usually it's just like where they come from, like what started the outbreak, but the zombie itself doesn't really get lore. It's just like, oh, we ate bad mushrooms or something. It's like some kind of imaginary magic virus that makes this, but you don't
Well,
really
it's either that they're actually dead that are walking, or that they're like
get.
sick humans that are like brain dead or
Becoming
whatever.
yeah, becoming zombies. But I think that's what is really interesting about Interview with the Vampire is that it really is the first vampire book that then, like, takes that idea of being damned and asks, like, "Well, what does the vampire think about it?" And turns out Louis is very
Well,
sad about
but
it.
that too, like again, a vampire story has to decide, are vampires dead?
Mhm,
Because like of the whole origin of like, oh, it's people in graves that seem to be alive. So it's like, are they alive or are they dead? And so a lot of stories will say, oh, well, they're basically the walking dead, that they are dead. They don't have a heartbeat. That's why they're so pale. That's why like they need blood to survive because they don't have any of their own or whatever it is. Whereas
mhm.
like the more, oh, they're an oppressed other species, it's like, no, they're not dead. Like this is just like one of the myths about them, like how racist of you to think that vampires are dead. They're just a different species, you know? So it's like, again, it's really interesting the fact that, again, it has to specify one of these things, but also it has to address it because of the whole origin of the myth in the first place is that like
Mhm.
there were dead bodies that looked alive. And so what are we doing with these guys? Are we saying they're dead? Are we saying they're not dead? Are we having sex with them? Are we staking them? What are we doing?
Well, and one thing that I think is sort of hilarious and says a lot about humans is that, like, a lot of the lore then comes around, can vampires have sex? Because, like, how do their internal bodies work? And I think that it's so funny to me that, like, early vampirism is like, oh, this is a metaphor for, like, women's chastity and things like that. And then, like, today we're like, okay, but, like, how would and could a vampire and Anne
If they
Rice, like,
don't
her
have blood, can they have an erection? That's the
yes.
important question.
And in Anne Rice's story, they don't have sex, and it's like not even it's considered like a specifically human need. It's not to say that there's not like
But
sensuality
that's what I
involved.
was gonna say, that it's like you
Yeah,
don't have
and
to have
pleasure.
like,
Yeah,
you don't have to have, penetration in order to have
right.
something sensual going on. And so then, like, is
Yes.
there, like, penetration? No. Is there lust? Yes.
Yeah, but it's like but it's weird how she writes it, or how at least that we get, and like I haven't read the rest of the series, and I think that it goes into different aspects of this with different people. Louis is very sad, and he doesn't really like he feels a lot of guilt about being a vampire. So the kind of desires that he has for people isn't specifically lust. It's like it's still sensual, but it's more this like deep interpersonal like connection with somebody who understands them, and like this sensuality built on that. And we do get the impression that the vampire bite is pleasurable, but there's not like it's not orgasms everywhere. It's not like the show I think plays up on that a little bit more. In the books, I was actually like waiting for the book to get spicy because of all of the stuff that I have read before Interview with a Vampire. But that's not what she's interested in. She is really interested in the moral quandaries of being a vampire and like what it means to be human, and like being a human in a vampire body or being a vampire in a human body and like what that means. Like what are the lines? What are
Well,
the boundaries?
and like again, back to the whole humans or chickens, if like the vampire bite is sensual, then instead of it being a conversation about like, sexual inhibitions and about women's like, women being overcome and their chastity being in danger, blah, 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 blah. Instead, it's a conversation about like, well, this is a humane way to kill your food because the food
Mhm.
is having a good time on its way out. Surely that's kinder, you know?
Yeah, and I think it goes into like the alluringness of the vampire. There has to be something that's pleasurable for the human if it's going to be lured into the vampire.
Well, and it's also like again, it makes people have to question things like when we slaughter animals, the fact that like you don't want the animal to be scared when you slaughter it because like that will make it taste bad. Is that like when the like adrenaline floods their system from like when they're fear of the hunter, that makes the animal taste bad. Like you want to slaughter an animal that's calm, that's unaware that this is going to happen. And so then surely that's what the vampire is doing is making sure their meat is nice and calm.
Well, and I think that a lot of the pleasure that vampires get, in specifically Interview with the Vampire, because with the early one, we don't really hear a lot about the vampire's pleasure. It's usually just like a power struggle, right? Like it's like the chase of the hunt and all that. But with Interview with the Vampire, and like in other vampire stories too, like I just read Dowry of Blood, which is a perfect combination of like the themes of Gothic vampires and like modern vampires. It's very much just like thrill of the chase. And like Lestat likes his victims to be scared and terrified, and he likes it to be very violent and bloody. And so it's like, how does the vampire want it? And like, what does it say about, is it
Well,
that
then
the
it's,
vampire
cat
makes
and
you
mouse, a cat
right?
playing with the mouse before it kills and eats it.
Right, exactly. But again, it's like for at least Anne Rice, it very much is like, what is it? Like, does who you were as a human change who you were as a vampire? And I feel like Claudia in Interview with a Vampire, she's the child that Lestat makes. She's only like in the movie, she's like 8 or 9, but in the book, she's only 5. So she is like teeny tiny in the book. And there is this whole kind of philosophical discussion around her. She ends up, because she's a literal child, it ends up becoming this exploration of like what would happen if you stop human development and have like just a vampire and you're raising like a vampire on its own. What kind of morality would exist? And so it's really uncomfortable because like she's then becomes an adult, living in a child's body, and like what that means as she moves throughout the world. But all of Anne Rice is really this like exploration of humanity and all of these like questions that would arise. Like, if I were a vampire and I existed in this space, how would that affect me morally and spiritually and all of that?
I mean, it's probably partly, not wholly, but partly the reason why Octavia Butler and Fledgling decided to make the vampiric character appear to be a child. Because again, it does always raise these moral questions in a very different way from what Anne Rice is doing.
Hmm.
But once again, like by putting an adult mind in the body of a child, or at least not the body of an actual child in the case of Octavia Butler's book, but a body that appears to be childlike as far as humans would like think of it when they regard it. So again, like Fledgling is doing a lot of things that isn't necessarily what Anne Rice was doing, but is once again taking the idea of vampires and saying, what can we do with that to tell a story that's going to be making us question our own morals, our own
Mm.
society, our own human relationships, how we interact and how we view one another, how we other people. Like the main character, who is this kind of childlike looking vampiric creature that is biologically a different thing. It's not this magical thing. But she is kind of bioengineered. Like the species already is vampiric, but she is specifically like been kind of bioengineered as like human beings theoretically could be, as they are in a lot of sci-fi. And they've specifically chosen to put more melanin in her skin when they like make her. And so then she's like being othered for like totally like racist, like, like human relatable reasons. And then also she's this vampiric thing, which creates its own
Mm-hmm.
set of problems.
And I feel like like the difference between Anne Rice and fledgling, because I was thinking about this a lot because I was really uncomfortable reading fledgling, and I think it's because with Anne Rice's, it's not really it doesn't really hold up a mirror. It's really just like this fun story about like a vampire like struggling with morality, and it kind of makes you confront like what is exciting about a vampire and is it okay for us to like what a vampire is. But fledgling is actually like holding up a mirror to all the ugly parts of humanity that actually exists, right? Interview with the Vampire is asking like why vampires are alluring and like should we be okay with being seduced by a vampire when they do these really awful things? But fledgling is like actually society is horrible and here are all the horrible things that people do. And so it's very much holding up a mirror to society and critiquing society as well.
Again, vampires are this real all-purpose kind of thing. Whatever message you have, whatever story you want to tell, vampires can do that for you.
Yeah.
Have I sold you?
And it just makes me, we haven't really talked about, I mean, I feel like in between all of these, big capital V vampire stories that have like shaped us culturally, there's like 100 little like urban fantasy stories that carry on this attraction to the vampire. And it's interesting that it's gone from this like there are stories that are these intense morality explorations, and then you have like here's everything that's fun about vampirism, and it's basically like enjoying hedonism in a way that's acceptable, right? Because like vampires are not human, so they can get away with doing hedonistic things that like we might as like normal humans feel shame for. So then they become this like space to like a safe space to explore fantasy. Like it just makes me think of the Vampire Diaries where you have
well, and it's also a
what are
safe
their names?
space.
Who are the brothers' names?
Damon and the other one, Stefan.
Stefan. Yeah, like Stefan is like, they both like Damon does like really horrible
But have you seen his blue eyes?
Like the first like 3 seasons of that show, you're like, wow, he's like really horrible. And then like you're like, oh, but he's pretty. And so like
It's
these
something
vampire
about
stories.
it's something about dudes named Damon doing terrible
Right.
things that people find attractive.
Right.
Because House of the Dragon, let me tell you.
Oh my god.
But
I
as you were
saw this
saying, a
like
safe
meme that was like colonialism's only okay when Damon Targaryen's doing it.
specifically Matt Smith is
Yes.
doing it.
But again, like fantasy being that space for that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say the safe space not just for hedonism, but for exploring like violence in sensual relationships, because in theory humans doing that to each other is just wholly wrong, although like I'm not saying that that's my position necessarily. When there's 2 consenting adults, there's a lot of wiggle room,
Right.
But like in general there's this kind of cultural sense that like if you're in a sensual relationship or romantic relationship with somebody, they should not be harming you. But for people who find the idea of being harmed very attractive and appealing and find pleasure in that idea, a vampire, it's like, well, they can't help it. So it's not that they're doing a bad thing. It's not that they're an evil person. It's that like they're a vampire. And so then like the fact that you're able to have any kind of relationship with them at all, despite the violence and danger of it, is like, oh, but like that's actually like a beautiful thing because like they're doing their best to not kill you.
And I think that what a lot of modern vampire stories do is that they even the playing field in the sense that like if you have a male and a female vampire, it takes away the if they're both strong vampires, then you don't have like one being stronger than the other. So in some ways it takes away that fear a little bit when they're both vampires. I think you see that a lot in True Blood. I haven't read the books, but in the show they play a lot with that, about the fact that if like if both partners are vampires, you can kind of do whatever you want because the stakes are so low. So you can act out this kind of violent internal struggle on your partner, which again is like you say that out loud and it's like, well, that's not okay.
Wait, but
again,
if there's no danger, then how is that exciting?
Right. Which is why like the whole like that's why we get Sookie's, her perspective most, because she's the quiet little fairy.
Well, and I think like
they all have to control themselves around.
Despite examples like True Blood, where there is an exploration of like vampire on vampire going nuts, I
Mhm.
think the vast majority of stories are between vampire and non-vampire because it is that power dynamic that people find
Mhm.
so like, as you say, it's a safe space to explore that because that type of power dynamic between two people. I mean, the perfect example of why you need the vampire is because if you tell the story the same way but make it a human being, it has to be Christian Grey, and everyone's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
that's
That's
worse
weird.
or
Yeah.
so much worse." So, like, because Christian Grey had to, like, have the same kind of, like, this lust for control and this lust for, violence and everything, but they're, like, trying to not be that way for the love of their life. It's like, when it's a human doing it, it's like, you need therapy. But if it's a vampire doing it, it's like, "Oh, well, that's their nature, and
Right.
they're doing their best, and it's so hot." So, like,
Yeah.
vampires, like, if you find the idea of somebody barely being able to suppress violent urges attractive, it's more okay. Society has decided it's okay if it's this, like, creature that wants to suck your blood.
Yeah, and again, in Interview with the Vampire, you do get more, vampire relationships than you do, like, with humans, because it is more interested in that dynamic, and how, like, they would go together, and, like, in the show, it plays up Lestat's and Louis' relationship. I was actually like, based on the movie and the show, I thought in the book, Louis and Lestat would be, like, lovers to whatever degree that vampires in her world could do that. But they don't. Like, Louis hates Lestat, like, the entire the entire book. And again, I haven't read the next book, which is about Lestat, but yeah, I was like, oh, Louis, like, really. I mean, but that's because he has so much self-hatred about being a vampire because he's a very sad one. So he's like struggling.
Poor Louis. Just a
Poor
sad,
Louis.
sad boy.
But I will say that Dowry of Blood, I think it came out last year, is probably one of the most recent vampire adaptions that really plays into gothic tropes, and explores like modern ideas of like the vampire being like this place to explore hedonism, but it also gets into the morality of like those power dynamics, and it really is this exploration of the trope of like being of like how these relationships look like the like abusive because of that power dynamic, but how that like plays out in a more modern landscape. So I do recommend that one as well because it's really interesting and doing like new things with that trope, not just sexy vampires. Although
I
they
don't
can be fun.
I don't personally find vampires very sexy, so, like, I've never understood it, but I have been fascinated by the phenomenon.
Yeah, I can't claim that, so I'm not gonna. I eat it up. I don't know. I can't
Well, I
do it.
think
I probably read it in all the
we haven't
forms.
talked about this, and I'm only bringing it up because I'm hoping you have an answer, because, like, with
Oh,
everything
yeah.
else, maybe I shouldn't say everything else, but with most things, I'm like, "Well, this came from this," or "This is why people chose to do it like this," or "This is why this would have become a trend with it," or "This served this narrative/cultural purpose." Like, I'm able to, like, kinda, like, figure it out, or at least make a good guess. I don't fully know why there's this kind of, like, maybe I do know why now that I'm thinking about it. But vampires, as a variety, as a flavor, they tend towards the, like, lanky, effeminate, thin,
Mm,
lithe, like, that's it. Whereas, like, werewolves and others are, powerful and thick and masculine and whatever. And so, like, this, like, foppish vampire, and I guess some of it is the, like, sort of, like, aristocratic kind of
mhm,
bench
element, yeah.
towards it. But there's, like, a real, like, emphasis on them being kind of, and the waifishness, I suppose, comes from the corpse. But, like, yeah, I don't know. I guess I've answered my own question. I guess but that's also why I've never found it appealing.
I mean, yeah, I think that kinda comes down to the very first one where you have this, like, the very first written one is this, like, aristocratic duke who's, like, tall and lithe, and I think
Except
it's kind of a ghoulishness to it as well.
I'm pretty sure that Vlad the Impaler was not, like, a foppish pale noble that
No.
nary a speck of blood would touch his
But
what's
Dracula
that?
was a little bit
What's the
more than that.
lacy thing at the neck called?
Not an ascot.
Cravat?
I guess you could have a lace cravat. I don't
I
know.
don't think that's it. Anyway, it
But
doesn't matter.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and I do think, it has its roots in Gothic literature and like the Gothic trend. And I think like that is a very distinct, I mean, Victorian era, people associate
yeah.
like we tend to then like have cultural associations, right?
Consumption, coughing into the lace handkerchief. I'm dying. Yeah.
Yeah, and, like, so,
Mhm.
I think, like, you in the Gothic period, you just had, like, this attention into ghoulish things and, paleness and thinness and all of that kinda
Yeah, I
stuff.
just like a milk white dude wearing lace with blood dribbling out of his, like, pasty mouth. I don't understand why anyone
Yeah.
wants that, but, do you.
But then I guess, like, none of the modern one I mean, like, 'cause Lestat and Louis aren't that way, although when we do
Lestat is
have the
that
remakes
way.
but in the book, he's not. Like, in the book, he's not that way, but I do think it's interesting that adaptions make him that way because that says something about our cultural associations with that, because
Well, I
Lestat
do
and
love the
Louis don't mean
adaptation of Interview with a Vampire, partially because of the fact that in that adaptation, Tom Cruise is so not Tom Cruise. Like he's playing this like foppish, like,
Mhm.
aristocratic vampire type. And like this is the man who's in Mission Impossible, who's in Top Gun. Like, and he's sitting at like a harpsichord with lace and is like talking about like it's just like and he's really good in it, and it's
Yeah.
just like really fun to see him play something so outside of his usual repertoire.
And I hate to keep going, but in the book but in the book, he's not really aristocrat. It, like, takes, like, the beginning the majority of the part 1 happens on a plantation house in, Louisiana, because that's where Louis is from. And so he does have, like, some French background, but he's very much not an aristocrat, and that's why he turned Louis is because he wants the kind of power that comes from being a plantation owner in America during that time. And so it's like later on that he then like takes up but even then like it's not the same in the book because it really is just about like Louis's own internal struggle and then the adaptions make more of it. And it could be that they're taking into account the second book is about Lestat. So like maybe the second book goes more into his point of view. But in the first one
Into
that's
his
not
lace collection.
into Louis' Griffon. But in the first one, he's just kind of like psychopath. Because that's how Louis sees him. Louis hates him and like sees him as a psychopath. And Lestat starts to feel like bad because he wants to be Louis's friend so bad, but Louis hates him for turning him into a vampire.
So, I guess my final quandary is why didn't we get any vampires from Shakespeare?
Well, funny you should say something like that because when I
And
was
with
looking
that, it's time.
I didn't know I was gonna be able to talk about this, and it's not vampires per se, but vampires are part of the Gothic tradition, and Gothic writers were heavily inspired by Shakespeare.
But not Shakespeare's vampires, because he didn't write any.
No, but,
Although I feel like some parts of Macbeth could easily be, like, construed as vampiric.
well, it's very much like his attention to, morally gray characters and revenge and all of that, and a lot of the early modern playwrights
I was
were
thinking more of
doing
the blood on the hands, but sure, we can say morally gray characters as why.
but you do have I mean the Gothic writers were really into all of Shakespeare's anti-heroes and all of his revenge plays and just like revenge plays from the early modern period more generally.
Oh, I
One of
bet
the
there's a vampiric retelling of Merchant of Venice where the reason Shylock wants his pound of flesh is because it's a vampire.
if it's not, they should write it in
Should
there
we though?
somewhere.
I feel like Merchant
Oh
has
wait.
problems
Oh wait.
enough.
No, yeah, I was gonna say now that I'm thinking about it, no,
Don't
you can't
ever
do that.
write that.
But in that period they did like using stage blood. And so they tried to use it as much as they could. And there's like a lot of stories, not necessarily I mean, you have Titus Andronicus that's cannibalistic. But there are more horrific stories that really are precursors to our horror trends. When I think the vampire
I
is
mean, we
part of
have
that.
Beatrice screaming, "I would eat his heart in the marketplace." You know,
Yes.
that's
And
pretty cool.
in later early modern plays by different playwrights, we do have people like eating hearts and drinking blood and things like that. And so you do get more of that exploration of like horror. And like, again, it's like something that was entertaining to people. So this thing that's like scintillating, but also horrific, which I think is kind of horror's thing, right? It's both like repulsive and titillating. And we're like uncomfortable with the ways that we're drawn to horror. And I think vampires are kind of on the cusp. Like there are definitely scary vampire stories, but
I mean, vampires and like stories about monsters and things that go bump in the night. Actually, this I feel like when I was on a trip recently with some friends, they weren't talking about this, but I think this is also the reason why people continue to tell horror stories, go see horror movies, have always like told like ghost stories around a campfire. My friend was saying how, because she's obsessed with true crime, and I don't really like true crime. Like sometimes I'll like engage in some of it. It sounds particularly interesting to me, but it's not like a thing that I'm like some, it's like a parody that like women are really into true crime.
right.
And my friend was saying that because one of my other friends was saying that she really doesn't like true crime. So like I'm kind of neutral. I'm like, well, if the story sounds interesting, then sure, I'll look into it. But I have one friend who's like, any bit of true crime. And then the other friend was like, oh, true crime, stay away from me. That's like horrifying to contemplate. And the friend who's really into true crime was saying how like, oh, but see, I feel like when I've watched a true crime documentary or I've listened to a true crime podcast or whatever it is, that I feel that I've confronted this thing that is a danger and I have overcome it. And now I'm stronger and now I can face it. And so I feel like that's part of why we tell these stories about things that go bump in the night, is because like part of it is that like the reason that people go on thriller rides is the adrenaline rush of being scared, and people just are adrenaline junkies. But also, telling these stories is a way of confronting the fear in a semi-safe way. And so then you can like, it's the reason that we have stories that contemplate death, because it's a way to like become acclimated to the idea. It's a way to kind of confront this thing that looms over you, this thing that scares you, this thing that you may come upon, or in the case of death, you will come upon. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. It's a way to like,
alert.
yeah, to get more comfortable with those things by like forcing yourself to be acquainted with them and by confronting them regularly.
And I mean, in some ways, what I think is interesting about like vampires, particularly, especially in the last like 60, 70 years, I mean, you have a history of female sexuality being repressed for so long. And like even early vampire stories are about like actually repressing female sexuality as something dangerous. And so then you do get these more modern stories where you get to confront all of those societal fears and then kind of work through them. And I mean, we don't have the same repression. We still have some of it, but we don't have the same. But again, it still ends up being this.
Cue the Monty Python clip. Help, help, I'm being repressed.
So I think, I mean, that's why fiction and art is so important, right? Because it helps us. I mean, we humans like need stories to help us work through all of our anxieties and our fears. And I think that vampires becomes a good representation and device for that.
And so we go from having grandma who we buried in the graveyard seems to be alive again to Hotel Transylvania, a fun film for children.
I forgot about that one. Oh.
So we literally, I think we planted those seeds way, way back in the day. And they have been fruitful. They done sprung out of that graveyard like daisies.
So at first we had vampires to explain away like bodily processes that we didn't quite understand. And now we have vampires to talk about our sexual fantasies. I like this trajectory.
That's not what I said. I said Hotel Transylvania, which could not be more different from sexual fantasies, but or you're watching Hotel Transylvania in a very different way than I'm watching it, which is valid. To each their own.
To each their own.
I mean, we've all had crushes on children's animated characters.
Have you?
Probably.
I think that's all I got. I was going to look through my notes to make sure, but I think that that's a good place to.
I mean, I thought a good place to end was me saying that we had planted the seeds and that they had borne fruit, but then we kept going past that, and now you end it. I don't have anything.
You're the editor. You can cut it off whenever you want. If that's where you want to end it.
Oh, no, you're in charge tonight, baby.
Oh, am I also editing this video? That'll be a journey.
You weren't before, but you are now. Well, I certainly enjoyed talking about vampires and the many flavors of fruit that they have
Mhm.
borne,
And
and yeah.
that's why I like what we're doing in this podcast, is I like looking at, like, what are the, first published ones? Where do these stories come from? I think it's just interesting to know where our current cultural obsessions come from and to see how long they've been around for.
And why it's no accident sometimes that they are still around.
And why these devices can make such interesting playgrounds for authors to test out their own theories, their own issues, their own
Well, yeah, I think
our own cultural anxieties.
as we talked about today, I think that it's half the fact that the concept itself is like a really versatile concept that so many different people can like take things out of, put things onto, etc. Like it's just like a really solid basis on which to like build your story, but also in a more kind of like communal way. The fact that there have been so many different stories using this concept already is itself a foundation upon which to build your story. And so then
Mhm.
it's not just, oh, this concept keeps coming back and back and back and back because the concept itself is so good. It's that we have a mountain built of concept, and so then you get to stand like on the shoulders of that mountain. That metaphor
Mhm.
fell apart. And your story gets like be lifted up by the fact
Mm,
that all these other stories, like your story becomes richer for the fact that it
mhm.
continues this existing tradition.
Yeah. Should I do like a thank you for joining us, or are we just how are we ending our podcast? How did we end last week? I don't even remember.
I don't know.
Thank you
Whatever
for
whatever
joining
feels
us
good.
on a once and future podcast. I was doing my podcast voice. Did you like it?
Yeah, definitely do that. I think we should end it on, well,
We
that's
can do
it.
some
Bye.
ASMR. Do some ASMR. Shh. I don't even know how it sounds.
I suppose we could be helpful and offer some. You recommended some things. We could generally
Oh,
like make some recommendations for vampire stuff that we found good. It doesn't have to just be books. There's lots of movies.
I think that if you are interested in this particular device, this phenomenon, I really do suggest. I really liked and enjoyed Interview with the Vampire, especially because I have consumed so much vampire media. It's kind of fun to go back to like the first kind of modern iteration of that. As I mentioned before, Dowry of Blood is excellent. Certain Dark Things was really great and a fun twist on some of our usual tropes. What about you?
Well, Fledgling is like a very harrowing thing to read, but I do think it's a really, really excellent book if one is inclined and able to
Hmm.
read that very uncomfortable book. So it's not like a good old time, but it is a good book. And another I guess recommendation is a movie that I actually found it miserable to watch it. But I think it's a fantastic movie because of like the realism with which it portrays the day-to-day life of what it would be like to be a vampire. And that is Only Lovers Left Alive with Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton, where this kind of like endless procession of days that like time ceases to have meaning when you are an immortal vampire and you can only come out at night and you drink blood. And that's your entire life, day in and day out, and the kind of purgatory of that. So
Mm.
like it's not fun to watch it. I think it's really miserable watching that movie. But because it would be kind of miserable, like for all these movies that are like, oh, to be a vampire, oh, the hedonism of that. And I'm like, or the like endless, nonstop,
Monotony.
unchanging drudgery of
Yeah.
that. Like, no, don't sign me up. So if you're ever like sad that you can't be a vampire, watch Only Lovers Left Alive and you'll be so never gladder to be human.
Or have you seen What We Do in the Shadows?
I've seen like one episode.
That's like a fun little parody on that exact thing. And about like what happens to those like old Victorian vampires who are confronting their own endless existence. And now I feel like I have one more thing to say about Interview with the Vampire, which was really interesting. It talked about how maybe we can cut this into the earlier conversation.
Maybe
But one
you
of
can
the
cut this in.
okay, fine. I can cut this into the earlier conversation. But in Interview with the Vampire, it talks about that like vampires, like yes, they can die if you cut off their head and light them on fire or whatever, but that most vampires die because when they've lived for so long, they get tied, like they get emotionally tied to a certain era in time. And as like the cruel march of time and progress continues, they then get stuck in this future that they were not prepared for, and that they're so tied to the past, they can't live in the present. They cannot change and adapt to the current, cultural norms. And so they just like waste away into nothing because it's like they cannot change. And I think that's a really interesting exploration of like humanity. Like if you had to change according to the cultural norms and like progress, like could you do it? Or would you
Well, yeah,
forever
and
being wearing a fedora?
I get that's well, this is like one of the many, many reasons why we could have like gone on for hours to talk about. If you take any individual piece of what has ever been a piece of vampire lore, based upon that one thing, you can have a exploration of like so many different things. So like
Mhm.
because of like what it is that vampires consume, you have a conversation about oppressor versus oppressed, about addiction, about meat, about like all these kinds of things. If you talk about their immortality, that by itself, okay, what would it mean to be immortal? Like a lot of Greek myths also talk about this. Like, is that a blessing or a curse? Speaking of blessings, are they damned? Are they dead? Are they just a different species? If we're talking about like that piece of it, now that's a whole conversation that's like very existential. Or we can have a conversation about like, are they just a different, again, just a different species? So is it just like, are we othering like a different race? Are we othering a different species? Is it just misunderstanding the other? There's just like so many pieces. And you can, of course, go for like Heinz 57 and have your vampires do all of the things. And they are allergic to garlic, can't go into churches, don't have reflections, etc., 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 and make them be traditional AF. And you'll still have cultural and societal and individual messages built into your story. And they're going to be there because you, the author, will be telling on yourself no matter what it is that you write about this vampire.
Mic drop. Huh?
Vampires are just like they're a Rorschach, they're a litmus test, they're a weather vane. They're just a good way to find out what people are thinking.
Mhm. And what people are invested in and what they're anxious about, and yeah. And I guess like all humans will die, and it's one of our biggest anxieties, and so vampires are a good way to talk about it. I guess we should end this. I'll think about a way. I'm gonna think about a way to like cut in some of this stuff and then like end with the suggestions. We'll see. Uh, I'm getting like pink again, like I was. I was gonna turn on the fan because it's kind of hot, but my fan is so loud. Should I end stream?
We haven't actually had an actual outro at any point.
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
We've been trying to find one again, but instead.
Well, what you said was fine. I thought what you said about vampires being
Okay, you don't end a
vain.
podcast the way that you end an essay. You have to like say farewell.
Okay.
So yeah, we could talk for hours and hours and hours, and we might do a part 2 or a part 3 or a part 10 on vampires and vampirism as the mood strikes us. But I think we've probably said more than enough for one episode. And I have to cut Heather off at some point. So we're choosing now to cut Heather off. And if she has more thoughts, then she will make me have another episode on vampires and vampirism. But for the time being, I think that'll do it until our next episode, which will be on another amazing thing that has seeds in the past bearing fruit in the present.
Nash night. Now can I end it?
You can end it.